within the last week, Russia basically rains missiles down on Uman, kills 26 people. Ukrainian generals respond to this by saying that they will ramp up an attack on Moscow. Do they literally mean Moscow, or is this just a way of saying against the Russian Federation army? Because they're two very different things in my mind.
Well, the border is 1,000 miles long. If you're sitting behind the Russian border, you've got 1,000 miles of terrain to protect. Remember that Ukrainians and Russians are largely indistinguishable from each other. And almost any Ukrainian can speak Russian, usually pretty well, although they too have an accent that is detectable. But certainly if you're going to pick people to infiltrate into Russia, you're going to be sure that their Russian is impeccable. And that's not terribly difficult for the Ukrainians. So I think the idea that they could pull off some sort of attack inside Russia against some building or target in Moscow is potentially believable. I mean, I don't think it's impossible by any means. The real question, of course, Steve, is how does this help Ukraine? I mean, it's unclear to me that killing a few significant actors on the stage in Moscow would help Ukraine's position. That seems very doubtful. Probably make it much worse.
Yeah. I'm sure that this is just from not having enough military experience, but there were a couple of members of Congress in the last week that were publicly saying that the Pentagon should send cluster bombs to Zelenskyy. My understanding is not only are these bombs illegal, but they're horrible. Can you answer that and then maybe tell my audience what these bombs are?
Well, cluster munitions, it looks analogous to a baseball. Imagine that you've got 1,000 baseballs that you can launch at a particular target, and these balls shower the target area. The bad news is that out of 1,000, perhaps 100 to 150 don't explode. Okay. That means that you now have an explosive device lying around on the ground. This happened to us back in 90 and 91. We used a lot of cluster ammunition against the Iraqi army, and when the war ended, a lot of these unexploded munitions were still on the ground, and you ended up having people stupidly pick them up. Sometimes they were picked up by soldiers that were logisticians from the rear of the army that had not fought in the war. They came forward for some reason, didn't know what they were looking at, picked it up, threw it like a baseball, and by the time it reached the individual they threw it to, it exploded and either killed or wounded them. We had the same problem with children. You know, up in Iraq, they went through these areas where there were cluster bombs and injured themselves. That's one of the reasons we don't like them. There are too many duds, too many unexploded pieces of ordnance. The fact that Congress wants to send more, you know, to me is bizarre. Right now, there's an estimate, new estimate. I haven't got it in hand yet to look at it in detail, but we think the Ukrainian army has lost nearly 10,000 armored fighting vehicles since the war began. That's incredible. 10,000? They haven't really gone that far. And that means that the Russians have been extraordinarily effective at targeting and destroying these things, number one. But number two, it suggests that the wastage over there is irreplaceable. You know, how do you make up for 10,000 lost armored fighting vehicles at this point? Well, it's virtually impossible. So sending anything more at this stage of the game may make people here feel good. Obviously, it makes members of the Congress, military, industrial, congressional complex happy, since this eventually puts money in their pockets in one way or another. But it's not going to change the outcome over there.